It's a beautiful morning in Berlin. The year is 1933, and Germans are living in the wake of the Weimar Republic. By day, universities are filled with scientists and philosophers. At night, cabarets are filled with dancers and partygoers. In Tiergarten Square, in the heart of Berlin, the Institute for Sexual Science is filled with physicians, researchers, and patients. It's the first establishment in the world to offer medical services, counseling, and sex education to the queer community. More than a doctor's office or library, it's a safe space for LGBTQ people in Berlin to receive care and a sense of belonging. And on this beautiful morning, Nazi students are on their way to destroy it.
They arrived early in the morning, this student group, with a band, with a brass band playing music to what they were about to do. They entered into the institute and they began utterly wreaking havoc. They threw scientific equipment out of windows and smashed them on the pavement. They overturned inkwells onto the carpets. They tore down photographs and pictures. They threw, books onto the floor. They ripped pages. They just went in with the intent to destroy. It wasn't even that they were carrying anything away. The original assault was just destruction. That night, the stormtroops arrived, Hitler's paramilitary group, and they gathered everything they could carry, and they brought it to a place called the Orpenplatz, which was a big outdoor kind of courtyard in front of the opera. They took anything of value and sold it. They piled everything else into giant wooden pallets, stacked as high as they could make it, and 3 days later, they set it ablaze.
For the queer community, the Institute was a haven, a place that affirmed their worth and their dignity. To the Nazis, it was an existential threat. I'm Julie Kohler, and this is White Picket Fence. This season, we're exploring America's gender backlash, the way that gender is being used as a Trojan horse to advance an extremist agenda. Last episode, we examined the current assault on trans people, how these assaults are eroding a broader set of rights and freedoms. This coordinated attack is what experts refer to as an anti-gender movement. Conservatives' effort to enforce two immutable genders, linked to biological sex, is foundational to their larger goal of creating, or recreating, a society in which men and women play separate and unequal roles. Today, we're digging more deeply into the connection between attacks on women and LGBTQ people and authoritarianism. What we're experiencing today in the US is frightening, but it's not unprecedented. The weaponization of gender and sexuality is a universal feature of authoritarianism. So to understand the current moment, we need to look at other repressive regimes, both past and present. So let's return to Germany, before the ransacking of the Institute for Sexual Science, before the bonfire of 20,000 books lit up the sky. Germany looked to be on a very different path.
Nazis were not a foregone conclusion.
The voice you've been hearing is Dr. Brandy Scalace. Brandy is a historian, novelist, and television show host. Her most recent book, The Intermediaries, tells the forgotten history of trans activists and the fight for LGBTQ rights in the shadow of the Third Reich. And that's where our story really begins.
It was really the destabilization of World War I that allowed a moment in time where the progressives could shuffle off the aristocratic power and say, the people matter.
Here is a very brief timeline. World War I ended on November 11th, 1918. On November 12th, literally the next day, Germany's new government promised that women would be allowed to vote. And 2 weeks later, they made good on that promise. By the following year, a new constitution was ratified, and the Weimar Republic was established. It was the first democratic government in German history.
And it was a deeply unsettling time in Germany. But as the Republic rose, it rose on the ideas of equality, equity, of social inclusion.
Under the new constitution, all German citizens were declared equal, with guaranteed freedom of speech and religion. The country became fertile ground for innovations in science, philosophy, and art. A progressive vision for the country felt possible.
It was actually catching on, and people were starting to understand that diversity and inclusion mattered. And at the same time, science was coming in, and there was these scientific discoveries that were starting to fracture old kind of religious ideology and saying, actually, bodies are real complex, and we can't say that everything that happens in your body is a conscious, moral, God decision.
This is the environment in which Magnus Hirschfeld, the founder of the Institute for Sexual Science, rose to prominence.
Magnus Hirschfeld was a Jewish man who was homosexual, and he was the son of a doctor, which meant very likely you're going to also become a doctor, and he does. But he was also deeply interested in literature and in poets, and he was a very sensitive soul.
Homosexuality was still illegal in Germany, as a law criminalizing same-sex relationships from the late 1800s remained in effect. And Hirschfeld remained publicly closeted. But he had very different moral beliefs about homosexuality.
He's a very morally, ethically minded person, and he feels that his homosexuality does not violate some greater order of good and evil.
Hirschfeld was charismatic and pragmatic. He wore tiny wire-rimmed glasses and sported a big mustache. He began his career as a general practitioner until one patient at the turn of the 20th century changed the direction of his life. This patient took his own life the night before his wedding and sent a posthumous letter to Hirschfeld. In it, he admitted that he was a closeted gay man who saw no way to live as his true self. He told Hirschfeld that he'd rather be dead than live his life as a lie.
And Hirschfeld took this as a mission, and he basically changes his entire outlook, his entire career, his profession, and he moves forward for the rights of minorities like homosexuals, but ultimately also of people we today consider transgender and asexual and bisexual and all sorts of other groups. And he joins forces with women too, who were looking for reproductive autonomy. So at this point in time, he says, I'm dedicating my entire life to this. And he absolutely does after that.
Hirschfeld studied gender and sexuality and wrote books and journal articles on the topic. While many of his predecessors and colleagues believed homosexuality was pathological, a sign of mental illness, Hirschfeld believed that some people were born with intermediary identities, meaning that they don't conform to heterosexuality or traditional conceptions of gender. Hirschfeld was willing to fight for his patients and their rights. So in 1919, he opened the Institute for Sexual Science.
He buys this beautiful palatial residence. It was sort of like an LGBTQ center. It was a safe space for people to go and know that they would be accepted. They were doing hormone therapy. They did some of the first gender affirming care, reassignment surgery, however you want to talk about that, but it's the way we think of it today, those modern types of surgeries. They did hair removal services for trans women who wanted to get rid of facial hair. That's all on the physical side. They also provided counseling. They did lots and lots of psychological therapy because they recognized that a lot of people had been through quite a lot of trauma. They did very comprehensive intake interviews to make sure that you were in a right headspace to have this kind of care, which we still do today. They also did marriage counseling. They did fertility training. And one of my favorite, comportment training. Essentially, if you were someone who came to the center and said, I am homosexual, I'm young, I don't know what to do, they would introduce you to your community. Like, this is the gay community. They would take you places like, here's how we comport ourselves at a gay bar.
Now, things weren't perfect in the Weimar Republic. Hirschfeld tried, but failed, to overturn paragraph 175, the law that banned homosexuality. Trans women were able to obtain, quote, transvestite cards, which recognized their identity in the eyes of the government. But they often had trouble finding work. Queer relationships were mostly allowed in Berlin, so long as they remained out of sight. Still, it's hard to believe that all of these services, which are still difficult to find in many parts of the U.S. today, were available more than a century ago. But progress and backlash are in constant tension. And the conditions that enabled the creation of the Weimar Republic, the instability of the post-war years, the need to build anew, also created space for very different ideas to flourish. Ideas that spoke directly to the people who felt left behind in this new world. Democracy was still fragile, and Germany had been decimated by World War I.
Germany's economic position was super damaged. They were weakened in lots of other ways, and there was a real sense that Germany was going to come apart at the seams. It hadn't been unified that long.
And in this uncertain environment, a reactionary countermovement began to emerge, one that followed the authoritarian playbook to a T.
Nazis don't spring fully formed like Athena from the forehead of Zeus in 1933.
Years before the Nazis officially came to power, Adolf Hitler began stoking fear and resentment.
He starts this disinformation campaign suggesting that they only lost World War I because women and gay people undermined the soldiers. This is completely fabricated. It was just a way of saying, we have someone to blame, that's why we lost. It made people who might not normally be nationalist feel nationalist because they thought they were under threat.
In other words, the Nazis worked to unite broad swaths of the population through lies, by manufacturing a common enemy. Jewish people were, of course, Hitler's primary target. His rhetoric was violently anti-Semitic and anti-immigrant, but it was also deeply homophobic.
So they start attacking gay people, and especially any gay men who seem feminine. And they say these are degenerates. They are destroying good German culture.
And misogynistic.
They thought women had no intelligence. They thought that women offered nothing to culture. I mean, they were extremely, extremely anti-women.
As the Nazis came to power, they restricted women's educational and professional roles. They attacked women's suffrage. And they launched a cultural propaganda campaign designed to convince Aryan German women that becoming wives and mothers was their highest calling. Their slogan? Kinder, Kuhach, Kirche, meaning children, kitchen, and church. Here's a tale told in two posters. In the US, Rosie the Riveter tied up her hair and flexed her bicep. In Germany, a blonde woman in a blue dress gazed down at her nursing infant, her fingers gently grazing its chin. And just as the Nazis were focused on enforcing a rigid ideal for Aryan womanhood, they were also obsessed with defining the right kind of Aryan man.
But this masculinity cult that rises up, and they do this through boys' clubs and other things, basically says any association with femininity makes you unsuitable, makes you un-German even.
This masculinist ideology relegated women, and anyone viewed as feminine, to the margins of society. Jewish men were particularly targeted, falsely depicted as effeminate and sexually predatory.
They thought Jewish people were pedophiles. They said they were going after your young girls. And I mean, none of this is true.
If that sounds contradictory, it was. But people still fell for it. And in this toxic stew, this anti-Semitic, misogynistic, and homophobic environment, nothing and no one represented what the Nazi Party hated more than Magnus Hirschfeld and his Institute for Sexual Science.
They called Hirschfeld the most dangerous Jew in Germany.
Here is another very brief timeline. In January 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany.
Dass ich anständig meine Zeit verwendet habe im Dienste meines Volkes.
In April, the German Student Union declared, quote, an action against the un-German spirit. They planned to cleanse the Institute for Sexual Science by fire. And just a few weeks later, they did.
They wanted to make it ugly because it had been such a beautiful thing to this community. Now, why? Why would the Nazis target a sexual science clinic like that? It's because it had had an incredible impact on bringing community together against the Nazis. And they did not want that. Their whole point was we need to cut this movement in half. We need to destroy it at the center, the place that has given them courage and strength. So to give an understanding of just how important the Institute was, one of the first things that they took out was the Institute. And so I think that right there shows you how much power they really had and how much influence they really had if the Nazis feared them, their community, and their joy that much.
Hirschfeld was living in Paris at the time. He watched his life's work burn to the ground via a newsreel in a movie theater. 2 years later, he suffered a stroke and passed away. The assault on women and LGBTQ people was integral to the horrors of the Holocaust. Misogyny and homophobia went hand in hand with anti-Semitism.
Hatred rolls downhill like a snowball. It begins with this seed of hate at the top, and it starts rolling and picking things up as it goes. So this misogyny picks up anti-Semitism, which was already around, picks up anti-gay, picks up anti-trans, and it just keeps rolling downhill until everyone feels like you have to stay as far away. You have to throw anything like that under the bus if you want to save yourself. The minute you start deciding which lives are worth living and which lives are worth protecting and which people get rights, who's allowed to not be kidnapped in broad daylight and shipped to a country they weren't born in, right? The minute you start seeing those kinds of things, hatred has already taken hold to a point that it has dehumanized members of our population. And it doesn't take very many steps from that to get to other kinds of protracted violence. So I think the most salient point to make is that you should be for diversity, inclusion, and equity because that protects all of us.
Now, it's certainly true that the US is not Nazi Germany. We shouldn't engage in false equivalence. But a propaganda campaign aimed at getting women to occupy a designated niche in society, framing LGBT equity as a national threat, an obsession with a specific form of masculinity, there are elements that sound awfully familiar. Over the same old news cycle, tune into Hysteria, your weekly group chat with Alyssa Mastromonaco and Aaron Ryan, where no topic is off limits. From politics to pop culture, they bring you brutally honest takes on the stories shaping our lives. From powerhouse women like AOC to wellness trends and education. No sugarcoating, no doom scrolling. Just real talk, strong women, and hope to keep moving forward. Catch Hysteria wherever you get your podcasts. And tune into their YouTube channel for full episodes and a special series. So let's fast forward to the present day and widen our geographic scope to better understand how the kinds of attacks on women and LGBTQ people that occurred in Nazi Germany are being replicated by other authoritarian regimes.
Attacks on gender and the use of gendered power, even the weaponization of gender, is a fairly universal feature of authoritarianism.
That's Annie Wilkinson. She's a senior research analyst at Political Research Associates. For the last 2 decades, she's conducted anthropological political research with feminist and LGBTQ justice movements. Early on, she observed that authoritarian leaders in a range of countries all around the globe were weaponizing gender and sexuality in similar ways. So Annie became interested in understanding why. What she concluded was that
it needs people to believe that some people are naturally meant to rule and others are naturally meant to obey. That's why gender hierarchy plays an important role, because it is one very pervasive power hierarchy.
And that gender hierarchy relies upon gender essentialism.
By gender essentialism, I mean that the belief that there is something essential to gender that is fixed and, cannot be changed, and that determines someone's role or position in society.
In an essentialist worldview,
there are, males and females only, right? Trans people or gender diverse people don't exist. Female sexuality is highly controlled.
And male dominance is
either biologically determined, so things like, men are just stronger or more rational, these kinds of ideas, or as something that's divinely ordained, like God made men to lead.
These beliefs about men and women's separate and unequal roles are often rooted in traditional religious beliefs. But equally important, they play a political role.
So what this does is it functions to naturalize gender inequality and naturalize inequality in general. And then it makes it seem inevitable or even moral or righteous.
It is this justification of power inequities that makes gender essentialism foundational to authoritarianism in its many different forms.
Authoritarians can actually have a variety of ideologies. Most often, those are right-wing ideologies. They could even be fascist ideologies. But in some cases, those who call themselves leftists can actually also engage in authoritarian practices and be authoritarian. So a good example is Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua.
Nicaragua is days away from holding an election that the U.S. government calls a sham. President Daniel Ortega is seeking a 4th consecutive term and silencing the opposition before the first vote is cast.
He was a leftist revolutionary turned authoritarian, and he has attacked feminist organizations. He has shut down feminist and LGBTQ organizations. He has banned abortion under all circumstances. This is a helpful case for us to understand how authoritarians use gendered power, because the goal is to exert and consolidate power.
In other words,
authoritarianism doesn't just happen to include cis misogyny or patriarchy. It really depends on them.
Many of us fall into the trap of thinking that all authoritarian systems operate like Nazi Germany, or even like the regimes portrayed in dystopic novels like The Handmaid's Tale or 1984, in which a totalitarian state
has pretty absolute power and control. And that is not how authoritarianism typically works. But it's often how it's portrayed in the media or sort of talked about.
But in reality,
I think of authoritarianism as on one end of that spectrum, in which power is deeply concentrated, and on the other end of the continuum, where power is most equitably shared. And this helps us understand authoritarianism and democracy not as, check boxes that we can check that we've arrived there, but rather as a continuum or as processes. So when I talk about and study this, I'm often looking at these in terms of the process of autocratization, or alternatively, the process of democratization.
And just as the weaponization of gender is linked to authoritarianism, feminism and gender justice movements are key drivers of democratization.
And given that patriarchy is one of the most pervasive and deeply rooted power structures in our society, feminists have long understood that pushing back against gender inequality and pushing for gender equality is foundational to a democratic society in which power is shared.
There are many current examples of strongmen leaders who have used attacks on women and LGBTQ people to divide, distract, and ultimately consolidate power. Leaders in Hungary, Brazil, Russia, India, Turkey. But Poland is particularly illuminating and relevant to what we're experiencing in the US. For the last decade, Poland has been toggling back and forth across the democracy-authoritarian continuum. Its right-wing populist Law and Justice Party has repeatedly used anti-gender campaigns as a tool for making the country more autocratic. And conversely, feminist activism has played an integral role in shifting the country back towards democracy.
Black Monday in Poland. That's the name of this nationwide protest by women angry at proposals for a total ban on abortion. They stayed away from their schools and offices to register their disgust.
Here's one more brief history. In the wake of its successful transition from communism in 1989, Poland was hailed as a poster child for liberal democracy. In 2004, it joined the European Union. Doing so helped fuel an economic transformation. And the country's evolution was so successful that it is often referred to as the Polish miracle. But although many Polish people benefited from this economic growth and the extensive economic development funds that the EU provided,
for some parts of the population that has stoked fear about losing ourselves in this sort of Western liberal world.
That's Elżbieta Karolczuk. She's a Polish sociologist at the University of Warsaw and Södertörn University in Sweden. She studies anti-gender movements and right-wing populism.
So the right-wing forces are using these fears or fanning those flames around those fears, trying to claim that we should be more independent from the West, that we should adhere to our traditional values, that we should adhere to our traditional religiosity, that Poland should seek more sovereignty from the European Union, right? And in that sense, the anti-gender discourse is part of this narrative of staying close to our alleged traditional values.
In 2015, Poland experienced a dramatic political shift. The Law and Justice Party won the parliamentary elections, and for the first time since the fall of communism, formed a single-party majority government. Closely aligned with the Polish Catholic Church, the party campaigned on protecting traditional families and gender roles. They framed Polish society and true Poles as being under assault from immigrants, refugees, feminists, LGBTQ people, and an amorphous elite gender ideology.
So this gender talk serves as an explanation of who are we as the people and who are our enemies as the elites, right? We are kind of normal people, right? We just use our common sense to see that, there are two genders and not 27.
This common sense understanding of gender is framed as an alternative to a progressive agenda that
has been promoted all over the globe by the elites, which to some extent is true, right? If you think about institutions such as the European Union or United Nations tying their, for example, foreign support programs, development programs with some elements of gender equality programs.
in effect, the Law and Justice Party successfully framed a push for greater gender equity within Poland and throughout the globe as
or a new form of colonialism, and started to mobilize local populations against something which they present as a project which is an offense to common sense, to their religious beliefs, to their conservative views. So this is a way to think about gender as something that is a threat to the whole structure of our society. And it is often seen, the society is identified with, of course, white, Christian, Western order.
once they came to power, the party immediately began undermining the rule of law, eroding judicial independence, curtailing the activities of NGOs, restricting freedom of speech and assembly, and attacking independent media. They also doubled down on their anti-gender agenda. Throughout 2019 and 2020, more than 100 local authorities adopted anti-LGBTQ resolutions. Some specifically declared that their regions were, quote, free of LGBTQ ideology. Others adopted family charters, which declared that marriage is exclusively between a man and a woman. At the national level, the Law and Justice government eliminated state funding for IVF. And while they introduced a direct cash transfer program for families with children, they were explicit in what they meant by family. They did not mean single parents. They did not mean queer couples.
So it is still a welfare state, but a chauvinist welfare state.
The ruling party also implemented a near-total abortion ban. And just like in the US, this move was deeply unpopular. And the mass uprisings that it sparked paved the way for a centrist party to take control in the 2023 election. They ran on a promise to make abortion legal at 12 weeks.
After the elections, the coalition didn't really push forward with the policies that would cater to this population. Nothing has changed in terms of abortion. Nothing has changed in terms of marriage equality.
And just 2 years later, in 2025, the conservative Law and Justice Party clawed their way back to power, winning the election by less than 1% of the vote. Elżbieta thinks this small margin was in part due to a lack of organization on the left.
If you compare the number of people who have voted for this coalition in 23 and the number of people who have voted for the liberal candidate in 25, they have lost 1 million of people. They went for the right-wing people, trying to, sort of turn to attract more conservative voters instead of, keeping the voters that they already have and keep them mobilized.
This political flip-flopping, the intense battle between democracy and authoritarianism, likely feels familiar to many Americans. The far-right leader takes power, galvanizes the left, who elects a centrist, who, for many reasons, is unable to deliver on a progressive vision for change. And in the midst of this disappointment and this deep dissatisfaction with an unjust status quo, a conservative authoritarian leader regains power. The left is at risk of learning the wrong lessons from these political patterns. In the US, we see Democratic politicians conceding to the right's talking points, but doing so is not successfully pulling right-leaning voters into a broader coalition. And this lack of vision causes the coalition to fracture.
They really wish it wouldn't stop us from coming together in the name of the values that we actually do share. Like the idea of the fact that, people have rights because they're people. Or the fact that we need the state who supports us rather than a state that, polices us. I think these basic ideas and the emotions that come from there can be still a source of hope and a sense of solidarity. And I really wish we could use it more.
We have seen how, just like in Poland, attacks on women and queer people are at the center of this political battle. But just as in Poland, this authoritarian faction is not only relying on these attacks to consolidate power. They are also pursuing an aggressive campaign to encourage families to have more children, or the right kinds of families to have more children. Next week on White Picket Fence, we'll explore how pronatalism fits into this anti-gender movement.
This is a war, and natalism is our sword and shield, and we will not abandon the front lines.
White Picket Fence is an Acast Creative Studios production. Our producers are Abby Delk, Sarah Schleid, Lucy Jones, and Joya Putnoy. Our editor is Maddie Foley. Additional editorial support by Vanessa Handy. Executive producers are Jenny Kaplan and myself, Julie Kohler. Original music by Sean Patel. Show art by Aria Goodman.